The alien woman thought the human warrior was weak, but what he did to her shocked her species. The stench of blood and scorched metal filled the air as Kieran Voss took his first stumbling step onto the arena grounds. The noise from the spectators was deafening, a cacophony of jeers, chants, and animalistic roars bouncing off the towering walls. He could smell the desperation and bloodlust before he even saw the throng of alien faces glaring down. Pain radiated through every fiber of his being, but he forced himself to focus on the present, to stay upright and ready. His body bore the marks of a life spent on battlefields, healed bullet wounds, knife scars, ragged burns. And in this moment, under the twin suns of the Zaltharis Dominion's capital world, every scar felt alive, pulsing in time with his pounding heart. He had been captured 3 days ago, though it felt like a lifetime. The Dominion's forces had ambushed his clandestine Earth-resistance cell. Most of his comrades had died in the initial assault. He'd been the one unfortunate enough to be taken prisoner. Whispers of the Dominion's new tactics had reached him. No more swift executions for humans who resisted. Now, they wanted to make a spectacle, to remind the galaxy of their overwhelming might by pitting rebellious survivors against their most elite warriors. The humans never lasted long in these matches, or so the rumors claimed. He drew in a ragged breath, ignoring the throbbing in his ribs. His short-cropped hair was caked with sweat and dust, streaks of silver in the dark strands hinting at a life far more grueling than his age might suggest. He surveyed the arena's high walls and the stands beyond them. One tier up, alien aristocrats reclined on plush seats, sheltered by energy shields to protect them from stray blasts. Their elongated limbs, elegantly ornate attire, and glowing eyes gave them an otherworldly presence. The Dominion's lesser classes stood jammed in the upper seats, braying for blood. He flexed his shoulders once, cracking his knuckles in a motion that had become second nature, the final ritual before a fight. A hush fell across the arena when the gates on the far side rumbled open. She appeared in the glare of the sunlight, backlit by dust clouds swirling around her. Vael Ari. Even at this distance, he could tell she exuded a lethal grace. She wore minimal battle armor, obsidian plates that wrapped around her torso and upper thighs, leaving the sculpted muscles of her arms and much of her midriff exposed. Shimmering skin with faint bioluminescent lines marked her as one of the prime warriors of the Zaltharis species. When she stepped forward, the roar of the crowd soared to a fever pitch. She was a gladiatorial icon, a symbol of the Dominion's invincibility. This fight would be yet another demonstration that humans were lesser, that their so-called warriors could be crushed by the elegance and superiority of her kind. But as she walked, something about her demeanor was colder, more calculating. Her eyes, a luminous violet that seemed to shift and flicker with each tilt of her head, locked onto Kieran, her lips curved into a sneer. He saw no mercy there, no pity. He told himself he hadn't expected any. He gripped the hilt of a battered short sword that the guards had tossed at his feet. It was a weapon meant more for show than effectiveness. The dull edges told him that. He sneered back at the watchers behind the protective barriers. They wanted to see him die slowly, humiliatingly. He would not give them the satisfaction of begging. A shrill, piercing horn signaled the start. Vael Ari moved first, sprinting forward with unsettling speed. Kieran flung himself sideways, narrowly evading the slash of her twin energy blades, which crackled with a strange alien current. The crowd roared its approval. He pivoted on one foot, bringing the short sword around in a wild arc. She parried, with the skill of a seasoned warrior, knocking his blade aside effortlessly. The force of it jolted up his arms, making his bones ache. They circled each other, dust swirling around their feet. He knew she was faster, possessed reflexes honed by her species' advanced genetics, but he was no stranger to impossible odds. He'd lost count of how many battles he'd gone into with death breathing down his neck. Survival was a habit he refused to give up. He launched a sudden attack, sweeping low with his blade. She sprang back, eyes narrowing, possibly surprised that a human had the audacity to go on the offensive. Her luminous markings pulsed once, as she leaped over his blade and slashed downward. Kieran twisted, catching one of her energy blades with the flat of his sword. The impact sent sparks dancing through the air, and a jolt of alien energy burned his palms. He gritted his teeth, forcing her blade aside, then slammed his forearm into her chest. She staggered back a step, just enough for him to gain space. Her expression flickered with something akin to indignation. He risked a quick glance at the crowd. The front row onlookers bristled with confusion. This human was supposed to be flailing, cowering, yet he was holding his own. The hush in the stands turned to a collective snarl, as if the Dominion nobility felt personally insulted. Vael Ari hissed, a low, resonant purr under her breath. She darted forward again, her movements a blur. He barely parried in time, the shock of each blade strike reverberating through his arms. She fought with a dancer's fluidity, no wasted movements, each strike carefully aimed. Kieran's breath came in ragged bursts, lungs burning. Still, something sparked within him, that old surge of adrenaline-laced determination. He bared his teeth in a snarl, refusing to succumb. The fight escalated rapidly. She managed to slip past his guard more than once, leaving scorch marks across his shirt and shallow cuts along his left arm. The crowd cheered each time she scored a blow, a bloodthirsty wave cresting over the arena. He pressed on, unleashing a savage flurry of strikes that forced her to retreat or risk getting cut. His battered blade was no match for her advanced weapons, but his unrelenting assault took her off guard. She caught his wrist at one point, twisting. Pain flared, but he ignored it, using the momentum to slam his elbow into the side of her face. She stumbled, reeling from the blow. A shocked murmur rippled through the stands. No one expected her to be touched, let alone staggered. He followed with a downward strike, a killing blow aimed for the juncture of her neck and shoulder, but she recovered with astonishing speed, blocking his blade just inches from her flesh. A flick of her wrist disarmed him. The short sword clattered to the sand. He refused to back off. Instead, he lunged at her, grappling her around the waist. They slammed down onto the arena floor in a churning cloud of dust. He pinned her momentarily, forearm across her throat, his heart pounding wild. In his chest, she stared up at him, her glowing eyes narrowing. He expected raw hatred, but what he saw was curiosity. Then her arms snapped up between them, the energy blade humming as it came to life. In one swift motion, she could have gutted him. Instead, she let the blade hover. He felt the heat of it on his abdomen, searing through his shirt. They locked gazes for a breathless second, time slowing to a crawl. He was ready for death. Yet instead of ending him, she hissed a string of words he didn't understand. Then a short, sharp blow to his temple sent him reeling. The world lurched. Darkness closed in around him, the roar of the crowd fading. The last thing he remembered was her face, contorted in an expression he couldn't decipher, and the thought that he had, against all odds, survived longer than anyone anticipated. He didn't know how long he was unconscious. When he woke, a harsh light blared overhead. The muted whir of machinery and the clank of metal on metal echoed in some distant corridor. He was no longer in the arena. A cramped metal cell surrounded him, and a dull pain pulsed in his skull. Slowly, he sat up on the narrow cot, trying to orient himself. The door slid open with a hiss. Violari stood there, a guard on either side, their energy rifles trained on him. She stepped forward, arms folded, the lines of her collarbone glowing softly. He expected a mocking grin, but her expression was difficult to read. Equal parts intrigue and scorn. "You fought better than any human I've faced," she said in her low, resonant voice, each syllable laced with an alien accent. "Perhaps you were worth sparing, if only to determine where that strength comes from." He swallowed. His throat felt raw. "Lucky me," he rasped, "earning myself a lab study session instead of a quick death." He braced himself for a blow that never came. Instead, she studied him, eyes flicking over his bare arms and the old scars that laced his skin. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" He shrugged, wincing at the pull of bruised muscles. "Life taught me mostly. I didn't have fancy trainers or high-tech enhancements." Her lips curled. She turned on her heel, gesturing for the guards to follow. The cell door hissed shut again, leaving him in near darkness. In that moment, he wondered what plan she had in store for him and why she hadn't just finished the fight. He could have died in the arena, proven the Dominion's superiority. Instead, he was caged like some wild animal for further observation. He lost track of time. Days bled together as the guards carried out routine checks, giving him barely edible rations and water. He healed slowly, the bruises from the arena fading. A sort of numb acceptance settled over him, even as he bristled at his captivity. Then one day, the cell door opened once more. Violari stood in the threshold, alone this time, clad in a lighter version of her armor. She beckoned him out with a single wave of her hand. The guards must have been posted outside, ready to take him down if he resisted. His wrists were bound by a metal band that hummed with energy, restricting his movements. She guided him through endless corridors, each twisting with alien architecture, half gleaming metal and half organic curves. The hum of Dominion technology resonated in the walls. They eventually reached what looked like a control chamber. A massive viewport offered a glimpse of the planet's rocky terrain under the twin suns. Dominion officers moved about in choreographed efficiency, rarely sparing him a glance. Violari led him to a side hallway, less trafficked and dimly lit. She stepped into an alcove and turned to face him. "You told me you learned to fight by living. I want to see if you can survive another arena." He tensed, searching her expression for a hint of mockery. "Why? Didn't I provide enough entertainment?" She folded her arms. The glow along her collarbones pulsed in a steady rhythm. "You humiliated me before my people, yet I cannot shake the feeling that you could have finished me." Had I made one more misstep? She inhaled slowly. Your existence challenges everything my species believes about humans. A part of me wants to see just how far you can go. He gave a short, bitter laugh. And the other part wants you dead, she said, though there was no heat in her voice. But I am bound by an oath to serve the Dominion. I do as they command. And they want to see you face something more brutal. He clenched his jaw. So be it. A flicker of hesitation crossed her features. It vanished as she pressed something on the cuffs binding his wrists, causing them to unlock and fall to the floor with a dull thud. He rubbed the raw skin beneath them. Let me guess, I can't just walk away. You'd be shot on sight, she replied. Your choice is to fight and live, or die now. He closed his eyes for a moment, drawing in a breath. I'll fight, she inclined her head. I expected nothing less. They returned to a smaller arena that afternoon, but it was no less deadly. The crowd was smaller, the hush more unsettling. The Dominion placed him against two enormous creatures bred for war, hulking beasts bristling with spines and exuding a nauseating stench. He fought with everything he had, hacking and slashing, dodging lethal claws. He drew on every ounce of cunning and resilience learned from countless battles. The creatures roared, acid-green saliva dripping from their jaws, but he exploited their lumbering movements, dancing out of reach, driving his blade into vulnerable joints. After a harrowing struggle, both creatures lay dead on the sands. The Piha watchers stood in stunned silence, and Vailari observed from the stands, arms folded, expression inscrutable. Her gaze followed him as he was led away by guards. No cheer erupted from the scattered crowd. Only a sense of disturbed awe rippled through them. Humans were not supposed to be this capable. He was not supposed to survive. She found him later, back in his cell, slumped on the cot, chest heaving. More bruises and cuts marred his skin, but he managed to push himself upright when she entered. She took a seat on a metal stool opposite him, leveling a cool stare in his direction. It seems you refuse to die. That's the plan, he managed, voice hoarse. I've witnessed Dominion elites fall to those creatures, she said quietly. Yet you stand. I need to understand how. He let his head rest against the wall, exhaustion weighing on him. There's nothing special about me. I just know how to endure. She watched him for a long moment, her eyes flickering in color, deepening from violet to a stormy hue. Then, without warning, she tossed a small bottle of salve onto his lap. Use it on your wounds. It will help. He frowned, picking up the container. Why? She rose, not answering. Before leaving, she looked back. Because I'm not finished with you yet. Over the next few days, the routine repeated. She would drag him to new fights against skilled alien opponents or monstrous beasts. Each time, he emerged victorious, though battered and half dead. Word spread among the Dominion's circle that the human was unstoppable. Some rumored he might be an augmented experiment or a product of black market genetic tampering. Vailari herself seemed increasingly torn between curiosity and the pressure of her superiors, who demanded a final, decisive confrontation. Late one night, sirens blared across the facility. By then, his cell door had been left unguarded, presumably because no one believed he could find a way off-world or escape the labyrinth of the arena complex. He emerged cautiously, sword in hand, to find flashing red lights in the corridors, Dominion officers rushing past, shouting orders in their strange tongue. Something had gone wrong. He crept through the hallways, searching for an opportunity. By sheer chance, he encountered Vailari in a deserted corridor, scanning a holomap with intense concentration. She looked up sharply when he appeared, leveling a small energy pistol at him. He froze, lifting his hands in a gesture of caution. They're evacuating, she hissed. The facility is under siege by rebellious factions from the outer systems. If we don't get out, we'll be caught in the crossfire. He swallowed. Good, I can use the chaos to escape. Her jaw clenched. You'll never make it. The entire Dominion garrison here is going on lockdown. That's not your concern, he said coldly, stepping back. She hesitated, then exhaled. I need you alive. You're evidence that the Dominion's beliefs about humans might be flawed. My superiors demand you be taken to the capital city for further testing. He narrowed his eyes. I'm not interested in being a lab rat. The floor quaked beneath them, lights flickering. Explosions rumbled in the distance. She shifted her stance, lowering the pistol. I can't guarantee your safety, but if we remain here, we both die. He gritted his teeth. What do you propose? A slight tension in her shoulders betrayed her uncertainty. We help each other escape this place. I know the routes, the protocols. You have a skill for surviving impossible odds. A bitter laugh escaped him. So we're partners now, she glared, luminous eyes narrowed to slits. Don't push it, human. He studied her, weighing the risks. The air reeked of burning metal, the alarms screamed, and in the distance, he heard the faint echoes of gunfire. He could try his luck alone, but having someone who knew Dominion tech was his best shot at getting off-world. Finally, he nodded once. Fine, Lead the way. They navigated the winding corridors as the entire complex shook under repeated assaults. Dominion soldiers clashed with rebel forces, the corridors choked with dust and panic. Vailari barked, orders in her language, using her status to pass through certain checkpoints, uncontested. She claimed the human was her prisoner, needed for urgent transfer. The lie worked a few times, though some soldiers eyed him suspiciously. The tension between them was palpable. She walked just ahead, side-eyeing him as if expecting betrayal at any moment. He kept his sword lowered, equally on guard. They eventually reached a hangar bay, vast, with multiple docking platforms for skiffs and small transport crafts. Half the crafts were gone, used by fleeing officers. Flames danced across the far side of the hangar, where a collapsed roof section had caved in. Vailari scanned the available vessels, eyes flicking rapidly between them. She gestured to a sleek black craft bearing the Dominion insignia. That one, it has stealth capabilities. He grimaced. Let's hope you know how to fly it. She shot him a withering look. I'm not incompetent. They sprinted across the hangar, ducking behind crates as stray blaster shots flew overhead. Dominion soldiers attempted to defend the area from the rebels, who fired from behind dislodged panels. One of the blasts hit a fuel line, erupting into a column of fire. Kieran shielded his eyes, stumbling forward. Vailari grabbed his arm, dragging him toward the craft's open ramp. A Dominion officer appeared, blocking their path, rifle raised. She snarled, dispatching him with a swift slash of her energy blade. Kieran vaulted over the body and slammed the control panel, sealing the ramp behind them. Inside, the cockpit glowed with unfamiliar alien technology. Vailari strapped herself into the pilot's seat, fingers flying across the console. He took the co-pilot's seat, struggling to make sense of the readouts. The vessel rumbled, engines powering up with a rising hum that vibrated through the floor. Outside, alarms blared even louder, but the craft lifted off the deck smoothly. They soared out of the hangar into the battered sky. Kieran looked through the viewport at a city besieged by chaos. Spires that once stood proudly had been reduced to rubble in places, smoke curling into the twilight. Vailari steered them out of range of the anti-air batteries, which hadn't fully come online yet due to the infiltration. A second later, a turret lock beeped, and a searing lance of plasma zipped past them. She maneuvered the craft into a steep climb, cursing under her breath. Their systems are still functional enough to track us. We'll need to exit the atmosphere and jump to FTL if we want to avoid pursuit. He grabbed the sides of his seat, clinging as the acceleration shoved him back. Then do it. She pushed the engines to the limit, the craft vibrating ominously. Another energy bolt grazed the side, causing sparks to arc across a console. She fought to keep control, cursing again in her own language. A rapid beep indicated a missile lock. He saw the contrail of an incoming projectile on the screen. "Evasive maneuvers!" he shouted, though he knew it was obvious. She angled sharply to the side, the missile streaking past by mere feet. It detonated in the upper atmosphere, the shockwave jostling them. Lights in the cockpit flickered. Vailari fought with the controls, forcing the craft into a near-vertical climb. His stomach churned as they broke through the upper cloud layer and into the dark, star-swept sky. Once they cleared the planet's gravity well, she slammed the FTL lever forward. The craft elongated the stars into brilliant streaks of light, and they shot into faster-than-light travel, leaving the Dominion-held planet behind. For a moment, the tension in the cockpit was deafeningly silent, except for the low hum of the engines. She let out a slow breath, resting her forehead against the console. He released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They were free, at least, for the moment. Their shared flight from certain death bound them together in a fragile alliance. He studied her for a second. Her shoulders rose and fell with exhaustion, luminous patterns flickering along her neck and the edges of her face in subdued pulses. She was lethal, unpredictable, and entirely alien, yet she had risked everything to get them both out. He cleared his throat. "So what now? You got me off that rock, but let's not pretend you did it for me." She looked up, eyes narrowing. "Don't overestimate your importance. The Dominion wants you for study, and I still have obligations. Sounds like you're on the run from them now too," he pointed out. She turned away. "They don't know the entire story yet. Once we find a secure place to regroup, I'll decide my next move." He reclined in his seat, feeling the bruises and cuts more acutely now that the adrenaline had ebbed. "Fair enough. Name's Kieran Voss. By the way, since we never properly introduced ourselves in the arena." She regarded him with an unreadable expression. "Vailari." He nodded once. "I guess we'll figure out what happens next together." She said nothing, turning her focus back to the console. The tension between them hung heavy in the small cockpit. He could almost taste her distrust, and something else, a flicker of curiosity. He felt it too, a pull, some intangible link, forged in the heat of battle and the precarious rescue. He suspected that thread might grow stronger before it snapped. They dropped out of FTL near a rogue planetoid, uncharted and drifting in the black void. Vailari guided the ship toward the surface, a barren stretch of craggy rocks and swirling, blue dust storms. The sensors indicated no sentient life, just harsh winds and sub-zero temperatures in the darkness of a perpetual twilight. She set the craft down in the lee of a rocky outcrop, the engines powering down in a low whine. Once landed, the silence pressed in. He unbuckled and stood, wincing at the stiffness in his back. He headed for the small cargo hold, rummaging through crates to see if they had any supplies or rations. Vailari followed, watching him with that hawk-like gaze. He pretended not to notice. He found a medkit, tossing it onto a makeshift table. He shrugged off his torn shirt, revealing a series of gashes across his ribs and arms. He caught Vailari staring, her eyes flicked from one scar to another, lingering. He'd long grown used to being gawked at by people curious or horrified by the tapestry of violence etched into his body. She stepped closer, resting a hand on the medkit. "I can treat those. The salve we use will speed your healing." Her tone was gruff, as though offering help was distasteful to her. He narrowed his gaze but stepped aside. "Fine." Her touch was clinical at first. She wiped away the dried blood, applied the salve that stung like 1,000 needles, then sealed the wounds with a spray bandage. He gritted his teeth, trying not to betray the pain. Her fingertips drifted across an older scar, the one that ran from his collarbone down his chest. He glanced up to see her eyes glowing a faint, curious blue. "You survived this?" she asked softly. He nodded once. "Got it years ago in another war. Didn't think I'd see morning, but I pulled through." He paused. "Why do you care?" She lifted her hand, the glow on her skin intensifying momentarily. "Because I was trained to believe humans were fragile creatures, yet you defy that belief at every turn." He snorted. "Because you only faced the ones who went down easily. The rest of us learned to adapt." A silence stretched. Then she turned her back, occupying herself with stowing the medkit. He watched her silver-white hair spill across her shoulders, the subtle luminescent lines tracing her exposed arms. Something about her presence was magnetic, a paradox of lethal elegance and surprising vulnerability hidden beneath. She finally spoke without looking at him. "We're safe for now. The Dominion knows our approximate coordinates, but not this exact location. They'll be hunting, though." He pulled on a clean shirt he'd found in the crate, grimacing at the pain in his side. "So we wait them out here?" She spun to face him. "We can't wait forever. The Dominion's reach is vast. They'll eventually scan for energy, signatures. We need a plan." He studied her, crossing his arms over his chest. "You said you had obligations to them. Now you're their fugitive. Are you regretting that choice?" Her jaw tightened, eyes flashing. "I follow the strongest path. Right now, that path is uncertain." He frowned. "That's not an answer." A spark of anger lit her face. "You question me, human." He stepped closer, refusing to be intimidated. "I question anyone who wants me alive for reasons. They won't explain." Their gazes locked. The tension between them crackled like static electricity. Her luminous markings brightened across her collarbone, and he felt his pulse quicken in response. He remembered the first time they clashed in the arena, the raw intensity of her gaze, and the moment she spared him when she could have slit his throat. She broke away suddenly, turning to another crate. "We need to see if we can salvage anything from the cargo to mask our ship's signature, or at the very least, rig something for long-range scanning, so we know where Dominion patrols." He let out a slow breath. "Fine, let's get to work." They spent hours dismantling and modifying the craft's systems, improvising ways to shield their presence. The planet's swirling dust storms offered some natural camouflage. He tried to ignore the constant awareness of her moving nearby. Every shift of her body, every flicker of alien coloration on her skin. At one point, they both reached for the same tool, their fingers brushing. She jerked her hand back as though burned, eyes narrowed. Neither spoke of it. The day stretched into an odd twilight, the planet's dull light never truly becoming a sunrise or sunset. They paused to ration out the supplies they'd found. Dehydrated food packs, a few canteens of water. She ate sparingly, gaze distant. He wondered if she was recalling her life before this, the comfort of the Dominion strongholds, the respect she commanded. Now she was crouched in a half-ruined cargo hold with a human she was supposed to despise. They bedded down in different corners of the craft, both too stubborn and distrustful to sleep in close proximity. He couldn't rest deeply anyway. Every shift in the silent gloom, every mechanical hiss, and every movement from her set him on edge. He drifted into shallow dozes, nightmares of the arena flashing through his mind. He'd jerk awake, sweat-soaked, half expecting her blade at his throat. When the next cycle of the planet's dim light came, they resumed repairs. She checked the stealth systems, cursing in her language at the extent of the damage from the escape. He tested the weapons, confirming which lasers and shields were operational. They worked in tense cooperation, occasionally exchanging curt remarks. Still, an undercurrent of grudging respect grew between them. She recognized how adept he was at adapting to alien tech, and he acknowledged she was more than just a cold killer. She had cunning, resourcefulness, and a resolve that matched his. During a midday lull, he stepped outside the craft, braving the swirling dust storms. The sky was a perpetual violet haze, tinted with neon eddies. Rocks jutted from the ground at sharp angles, giving the landscape a harsh, forlorn beauty. The wind whipped at his hair and stung his eyes. He saw Violari's reflection in the ship's hull, stepping out after him. She wrapped an insulating cloak around herself, the dust storms hardly fazing her. "You'll freeze if you stay out too long," she said, raising her voice over the wind. He turned to face her. "Needed to stretch my legs. Being cooped up in that tin can is suffocating." She nodded slowly, scanning the horizon. "There's something about this place. I've never seen a world so devoid of life." She paused, or hope. He glanced at her, noticing that the swirling dust reflected in her eyes, shifting the color to a deep cobalt. "I gave up on hope a long time ago. I focus on survival." She walked closer, the wind plastering her cloak against her tall, lean frame. "Your survival instinct is remarkable. In the arena, I saw men and women crumble at the slightest wound, but you fought through injuries that would kill most. You fight like someone with nothing to lose." He barked a humorless laugh. "That's because I don't have anything left to lose. The Dominion destroyed my home, my people. They turned Earth into a graveyard. I've been fighting ever since." She studied him, lines of tension around her mouth. "I was raised to believe the Dominion brought order to lesser worlds, that we improved them, integrated them." "Yeah, that's the Dominion's propaganda," he growled. "Ask the corpses if they feel integrated." A flicker of conflict passed over her face. The wind roared around them, carrying bits of blue dust. She lowered her eyes. "I'm not naive. I know the cost of conquest, but my father told me it was necessary for the Dominion to spread its influence, that it was the only way to maintain stability among the stars." He shook his head, lips pressed thin. "Stability built on bones and ash isn't stability at all." She didn't answer, just held his gaze as a swirl of dust rose between them. He glimpsed that uncertain vulnerability behind her defiant exterior, and for a moment, something in his chest tightened. He had to remind himself who she was. An alien warrior from the Empire that had annihilated his world. That flash of connection, of empathy, threatened to unravel the carefully erected walls he'd built. She turned away first, drawing her cloak tighter. "Let's get back inside before we freeze." He nodded silently. They headed back into the craft, sealing the hatch against the shrieking wind. The interior felt warmer now, the hum of the generator sustaining life support. He settled by the makeshift table, flipping open a datapad he'd salvaged. Violari paced the length of the compartment, occasionally peering out a viewport. Then the console beeped, a proximity alert. They both raced to the cockpit, hearts pounding. She slid into the pilot's seat, scanning the readouts. His stomach twisted as an ominous wave of data scrolled across the screen. "Dominion signature," she said, voice tight. "They're scanning the region." He clenched his fists. "How far?" "Close," she muttered, adjusting the sensors. "They may have picked up residual energy from our engines. They haven't pinpointed our location yet, but they're sweeping the area." He glanced out the viewport. The dust storm might offer some protection, scattering sensor readings. "We need to kill all non-essential power." She nodded, flipping a series of switches. The lights dimmed, the hum of the engines dying to a whisper. The air in the cabin felt thicker, colder. They waited in tense silence, listening to the faint beep of the scanner. Outside, the wind howled. Minutes dragged on like hours. Finally, the scanner beeped again. She exhaled a shaky breath. "They've moved on." He allowed himself a faint sigh of relief. "We're not safe, though. They'll keep sweeping until they find a clue." She rubbed her temples. "We need to relocate, but the engines will give us away." He searched the cabin. "Maybe we could mask the output with the planet's storms, or do short hops at intervals." She slumped back in the seat, eyes closing momentarily. "Rest first. We'll decide our next move in a few hours." He opened his mouth to argue, but realized his body was screaming for rest. They retreated to their separate corners again, the gloom pressing in. The temperature had dropped further with the power cut. He lay on his back, staring at the overhead panel in near darkness. Violari's breathing was barely audible across the room, but he was acutely aware of her presence. He wondered how this had become his life, allying with an alien warrior, trapped on some nameless rock, pursued by the empire that had ruined everything he knew. Exhaustion tugged at him, and soon he drifted into a fitful sleep, filled with fragmented dreams of Earth, bombs falling from the sky, and silver-white hair gleaming under twin suns. A faint shuffle woke him. He rubbed his eyes, noticing Violari moving across the cabin with careful steps. She checked the scanners again, then rummaged through supplies. He sat up, stiff from the cold. Her gaze flicked to him, then away. "There's a break in the storm in about an hour," she said. "We can attempt a low-powered flight over the ridge, see if we can find a better hiding place." He nodded, stretching his shoulders. The tension between them lingered, cautious, unspoken. After a few moments, he joined her at the console. They worked in silence, charting possible flight paths that would minimize detection. Every so often, their arms or hands brushed, and an uncomfortable spark shot through him. He knew she felt it too, though she kept her face neutral. When the dust storm lessened, they prepped the engines at minimal power, with the external lights off. The craft lifted gingerly off the ground, skimming just above the rocky surface. Violari guided them across the rugged terrain, weaving between spires of jagged stone. Outside, the wind shrieked intermittently, but the break-in, the storm allowed for smoother navigation. As they crossed a canyon, the scanners picked up a series of caverns embedded in the cliff walls. She steered them closer. The opening was wide enough for the craft to slip through, though it looked to be a tight fit. He grimaced, half expecting a crash, but she exhibited the same careful precision she'd shown in combat. They glided into the cavern, setting down on a natural rock shelf that extended just far enough for landing. The engines powered down, enveloping them in muffled darkness. They activated minimal lighting, revealing walls of twisted stone that stretched into subterranean depths. Water droplets echoed somewhere in the distance, suggesting an underground reservoir. He hopped out of the craft, scanning the area with a portable light. Violari followed, checking the stability of the cavern floor. "It's stable enough," she pronounced after a cursory examination, "and hopefully thick enough to shield our signature from overhead scans." He nodded, venturing deeper into the cavern. The temperature here was marginally warmer, likely due to geothermal vents. The floor sloped downward, revealing a series of tunnels. He halted at a fork, shining his light in each direction. "We should mark our way," he said, "or we'll get lost." She handed him a small device that could etch glowing marks onto stone. They began exploring, leaving a trail of faint glyphs to guide them back. The deeper they went, the more the outside world seemed to fall away. Occasionally, they heard a distant rumble, possibly the storm overhead or shifting rock. Time lost meaning in the dim labyrinth. At one point, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like the teeth of a giant beast, and a pool of dark water shimmered at the center. He stepped closer, crouching, breathing in the cool, damp air. Violari lingered behind him, a half-seen silhouette in the faint glow of the device. He drank a handful of water, relieved to find it fresh. They both filled canteens, mindful of contaminants, but they had little choice. Survival demanded risks. When they settled on a flat ledge to rest, they found themselves sitting uncomfortably close. He could feel the warmth radiating from her, an odd contrast to the clammy chill of the cavern. She looked down at her hands, luminous patterns flickering across her arms. "You risked everything to fight the Dominion. You lost your planet, yet you keep going. Why?" He stared at the dark water, memories churning. "After Earth fell, I realized I had nothing left but the fight. It's all I've got to keep. Me moving forward." She traced a finger over the stone at her side. "I was raised to be an elite warrior, told that ensuring the Dominion's dominance was the greatest honor. Now I'm sitting here with you, questioning everything I believed." He glanced at her, seeing the conflict etched in her features. "What changed?" Her eyes lifted to meet his. "You did." His chest tightened. He wanted to say something, but his voice stuck in his throat. They held each other's gaze, the sound of dripping water magnified in the silence. The faint glow along her skin grew brighter, pulsing in a way that drew his attention to the curve of her neck, her collarbones, the lines that disappeared beneath her light armor. A jolt of awareness zinged through him. This was not a safe path. This intangible lure he felt toward her. He had been her prisoner, her adversary. She was part of the empire that exterminated his world. Yet in this subterranean world, cut off from everything else, all that mattered was that they were alive and had found a fragile trust. She broke the moment by standing suddenly, crossing to the other side of the chamber. "We should head back," she said, voice clipped, as though angry at herself for that flicker of vulnerability. He exhaled slowly, rising to follow. "Right." They made their way back to the ship, the tension practically a living thing between them. Once inside, they sealed off the exit, triple-checking the stealth systems. Hours passed in uneasy silence. He busied himself with maintenance tasks. She pretended to be deeply focused on analyzing sensor data that never changed. Eventually, they both drifted into an exhausted sleep. He woke first, disoriented, noticing the cabin temperature had stabilized. She was slumped in the pilot's seat, arms folded, head bowed. Strands of her silver-white hair fell across her face. He watched her in the dim glow of the console, recalling how lethal she had been in the arena, how she had pinned him with her blade at his throat. It was a stark contrast to the quiet, almost peaceful expression she wore now. He tried to quell the stirring of unwanted feelings. She was his enemy, or at least she had been. He couldn't afford to trust or care about her too deeply. They were in a war, and attachments were weaknesses, but his mind kept drifting back to the memory of her saving his life, the brush of her hand while tending his wounds, the moment. In the cavern when their eyes locked, a sudden beep shattered the silence. She snapped awake instantly, hand moving to her sidearm. He blinked, focusing on the console. The scanner was picking up new signals, multiple small craft in the atmosphere. The Dominion was intensifying their search. He moved to stand behind her seat as she pressed a few buttons, zooming in on the signals. "There are 3 patrol ships," she said, voice still husky from sleep. "They're converging on the region near the coordinates of our old landing site." He tensed. "They might not find the cavern, but this means we're stuck." She nodded grimly. "We have to assume they'll do surface sweeps. If they come too close, we might have to abandon the ship and retreat into the tunnels." He dragged a hand down his face. "Great, that'll be fun." They powered down almost everything except critical systems, hoping to remain hidden. She pulled up a small holographic map of the sector, analyzing possible routes off-planet that avoided Dominion detection. He watched her, arms folded, trying not to notice the graceful curve of her neck or the faint glow that traced her jawline. That attraction simmered just beneath the surface, an undercurrent both thrilling and dangerous. The tension boiled over later that day. When a Dominion drone skimmed the outer edge of the cavern, the scanner beeped madly, detecting the faint presence of the drone. They shut down the last of the power, plunging the interior into near-total darkness, relying on emergency battery for life support. For a nerve-wracking stretch of minutes, they heard the drone's engines whine just outside. He held his breath, poised to fight if discovered. Violari stood beside him, weapon ready. Their shoulders brushed in the cramped space. And despite the threat outside, his pulse jumped at the contact. Finally, the drone's noise faded, the scanner quieted. He let out a pent-up breath. She eased her grip on her pistol. In the dark, they could barely see each other's silhouettes. Her breathing was rapid, matching his own. A minute passed before she flicked on a small handheld light. "We can't stay here indefinitely," she murmured, voice taut. "Sooner or later, they'll find us." He nodded, exhaling. "Then we find a way off this planet that doesn't involve them blowing us out of the sky." She arched a brow, though in the dim light he only saw the shift of her glowing eyes. "You say it like it's a simple task." He forced a grim smile. "It's never simple, but we can't just wait to be hunted." She seemed about to argue, but then she paused, tilting her head. "Do you hear that?" He listened, at first catching only the faint drip of water deeper in the cavern. Then, a low rumble, like shifting rock, reverberated through the hull. The floor trembled. They both steadied themselves. "Could be a geological shift," she said, activating the console just enough to run a quick scan. The map of the cavern flickered into view. A bright spot flared, indicating a collapse in one of the tunnels. He grabbed a portable light. "Better check it out. Make sure we're not about to be buried." They ventured out of the craft, following the same path they had taken earlier. The rumbling grew louder, the ground vibrating beneath their feet. By the time they reached the large chamber with the underground pool, they found part of the ceiling had caved in, blocking the main route they had used. Dust clouded the air, forcing them to cover their mouths. He shone his light across the debris. "Well, that's not good," she cursed under her breath, stepping closer to inspect. "We can clear some smaller rocks, but the rest will take hours or days. We don't have that kind of time." He scanned the cavern walls. Maybe there's another way around. They skirted the fallen debris, searching for alternative passages. At the far side of the chamber, half submerged in the dark water, he noticed a crag that looked like it might open into another tunnel. He waded into the shallow edge of the pool, ignoring the icy shock. The light's beam revealed a crevice behind the water's surface. "Over here," he called. "Might be a passage." She joined him, stepping into the water with a slight shiver. It reached mid-thigh, soaking her leggings. The glow on her skin brightened slightly at the temperature change. She pressed her palm against the rough stone, testing for stability. The crevice yawned wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "It leads somewhere," she said, tilting her head to listen to the distant echo. "We might as well try," he exhaled, bracing himself. "After you." She shot him a scowl that he half read as a smirk. They slipped into the crevice, climbing over rocks slick with moisture. The darkness pressed in on them, the only light coming from the dim glow of her skin and his handheld. The tunnel angled upward, leading them away from the pool. He ducked under stalactites, mindful not to slip on the uneven ground. They reached a small chamber, the air thick and stale. Water dripped steadily from above, forming puddles on the floor. A single narrow passage veered off to the side. She was about to move forward when the ground shifted beneath her. She stumbled, ankle twisting. He lunged, catching her by the arm, his other hand wrapped around her waist, preventing her fall. She let out a sharp breath, her hands gripping his shoulders. They were pressed close, her luminous eyes wide, chest heaving from the sudden jolt. A spark ignited in the small space between them, something raw, born from close calls and shared dangers. He inhaled, her scent a mix of sweat, dust, and an underlying alien musk that was inexplicably enticing. Her voice trembled with suppressed adrenaline. "I'm fine." He didn't let go. A swirl of conflicting emotions roiled inside him. Anger at her species, fear for his life, desperation for a way out. Yet beneath it all, an undeniable attraction crackled like a live wire. She felt it too. He could see it in the shifting color of her eyes, the brightening glow along her neck. Her breathing became shallow, and her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt. He opened his mouth to speak, but words died before they formed. Something in her expression, a flicker of vulnerability, broke whatever fragile barrier still stood. The next moment, her mouth crashed against his in a fierce kiss, and he found himself responding with equal fervor. The cave around them disappeared, overshadowed by a surge of heat that pulsed in time with his racing heart. He pressed her back against the damp stone, the handheld light dropping to the floor. It cast flickering shadows as they grappled at each other's clothing. Her lips were warm, her teeth grazing his lower lip in a way that sent jolts of pleasure through him. He cupped the back of her neck, feeling the luminescent lines pulse against his palm. Her armor plates shifted, revealing more of her skin, shimmering with that mesmerizing glow. She made a low, throaty sound, a purring growl that reverberated through his chest. He slid his hands down her waist, pressing their bodies together. He didn't think about the war, about what she was, or what he was supposed to hate. In that instant, primal desire overrode every other thought. Adrenaline, fear, anger, and relief all transmuted into raw need. Her hands gripped his shoulders, pulling him closer. She tugged at his shirt, and he quickly shed it, revealing the scars that dotted his torso. She traced the contours of them, her bioluminescence surging wherever her fingertips grazed. Their breaths mingled in the stale air, echoing off the walls. He slid a hand under what remained of her armor, finding the warm curve of her hip. She groaned softly, arching into him. They stumbled further into the small chamber, half tripping over uneven ground, never breaking contact. He peeled away her remaining armor plates, letting them clatter to the stone floor. She shed the light fabric beneath, revealing skin that glowed in swirling patterns along her collarbones and down her navel. She was all lean muscle and sinew, a warrior's body that radiated deadly grace, now trembling with desire. He kissed down her neck, tasting the salt on her skin. She responded with a shiver, nails digging into his back hard enough to draw blood. He didn't care. Pain and pleasure blurred. He pressed his forehead to hers for a moment, panting, gazing into eyes that shifted between violet and cobalt. They shared a fleeting look of mutual understanding. This was bigger than sense or reason, an inevitability forged by their intertwined fates. His hand slid between her thighs, drawing a gasping moan from her parted lips. She let her head fall, back against the stone. Hair splayed out, the luminescent patterns intensifying across her throat and chest. He explored her body in reverent fascination, marveling at how her skin lit up beneath his touch. Every brush of his fingers coaxed another flicker of color and a quiver of longing. She reached for the fastenings on his pants, fumbling in her urgency. He helped, and soon they were free of every barrier between them. They pressed together with desperate hunger, the cold air forgotten. His mouth found hers again, and she kissed him with a ferocity that bordered on violence. Teeth scraping, tongues dueling, their bodies met in a searing collision that drove the breath from his lungs. When he finally entered her, the moment was electric, a raw surge of sensation that wrung a ragged groan from both of them. The friction, the tight heat, the pounding of blood in his ears. It all fused into a crescendo of need. She wrapped her legs around him, urging him deeper, her hands gripping his arms as though she might tear him apart if he stopped. The cave walls glimmered with the reflection of her bioluminescence, each thrust accentuating the shifting glow. They moved in a frantic rhythm, chasing the oblivion that beckoned after so many close brushes with death. Each time he tried to slow to savor the moment, she growled in protest, rolling her hips in demand. His thoughts fragmented, consumed by the taste of her skin, the sound of her ragged moans, the pressure of her nails digging into his shoulders. Nothing else existed, except this tempest of aggression and lust. He felt the tension coil tighter in his core. She threw her head back again, lips parted on a silent scream, the glow around her eyes flaring. In that final, delirious moment, they crashed over the edge together. Pleasure slammed through him, in powerful waves, amplified by her shuddering cry that echoed off the walls. They clung to each other, hearts pounding, bodies trembling with the force of it. For a brief span, They stayed locked in that embrace, panting in the darkness. His forehead rested against her collarbone, which still pulsed with a subdued light. Her breaths came in sharp, staggered gusts against his ear. Gradually, the reality of the cave seeped back in, the drip of water, the chill in the air, the faint scratch of stone against skin. He gently set her down, stepping back. She leaned against the wall for support, a mixture of exhaustion and astonishment in her eyes. He retrieved the handheld light, returning to shine it on them. She was even more breathtaking in that moment, hair disheveled, cheeks flushed, chest heaving. He could see the trails of tears in her glowing lines, the aftershocks of what they'd just shared. Neither spoke. Words seemed impossibly small compared to the chaos of emotions roiling between them. Slowly, they dressed, the cave's chill making them shiver. He helped secure her armor plates in silence. She tied her hair back, avoiding his gaze, though her luminous markings still flickered with residual intensity. When they were both clothed, again, he finally dared to meet her eyes. She looked at him with a complex mixture of defiance, confusion, and an unspoken tenderness. He opened his mouth, but no coherent words formed. She placed a finger to his lips, shaking her head. "Don't," she whispered. "This changes nothing. We're still hunted. We're still at war." He nodded, though his heart twisted. "I know," she exhaled, steadying herself. "We should go. We haven't fully explored this passage. It might lead us to a safer exit." He swallowed, the lingering taste of her on his lips. Right. They pressed on through the tunnel, leaving the site of their frenzied union behind. The air felt colder now, or perhaps it was the aftermath settling in. She walked ahead, scanning for traps or weak points. He followed at a short distance, wrestling with a tangle of guilt and exhilaration. A single question pounded in his skull. What the hell are we doing? They emerged in a different part of the cavern system, eventually finding another route back to their ship. No more words were spoken of what transpired. Once back aboard, they powered on a few systems. He busied himself checking the engines while she monitored the scanners. Outside, the dust storm had partially returned, providing a veil that likely hid the craft from overhead patrols. That was some consolation. Even so, the tension between them had shifted. It wasn't anger or distrust now, but something else, an intimacy that was deeper than any words they could exchange. He avoided meeting her eyes, though he could sense her presence acutely. The memory of her body, the taste of her lips, refused to leave him. They eventually confronted the practical realities of their situation: limited rations, the looming threat of discovery, the uncertainty of the next step. A day passed in tense semi-silence, each of them snatching uneasy sleep. Though they avoided discussing the tryst in the cave, neither could pretend it didn't exist. More than once, he felt her gaze on him, a flicker of heat crossing her features before she turned away. The next morning, the scanners beeped again. This time, it wasn't just a lone Dominion craft. It was a formation of 3 vessels, sweeping methodically across the planet's surface. She cursed. He checked the readouts, a knot of dread forming in his gut. They seemed to be triangulating data, narrowing down potential hideouts. Violari rose from the console, pacing. "We can't stay. They'll find this cavern eventually." He tensed. "So we make a run for it." She shot him a sharp look. "Through 3 Dominion ships. They'll shoot us down." He met her gaze, stepping closer. "We can't hide in the caves forever. We'll starve or get cornered. Sometimes you have to fight." Her eyes flickered. He could see the old warrior pride warring with caution. Finally, she nodded. "We'll have to be smart. Hit them from an unexpected angle." Together, they devised a plan that involved using the planet's volatile dust storms to mask their approach. They'd break atmosphere on the far side of the planet, hopefully out of range of the patrol's direct line of sight, then jump to FTL as soon as they cleared the gravity well. It was a gamble. One good shot from a Dominion cruiser and they'd be dust in the void. She prepped the craft while he stripped out any non-essential parts, hoping to boost power to the shields. They worked side by side, unspoken memories simmering between them. Once the modifications were done, they took a final inventory of their meager supplies. The moment of truth had arrived. They powered up in a controlled surge, letting the engines warm with minimal output. Then, with a quick nod to each other, Valari lifted the craft off the cavern floor. The landing struts retracted, scraping rock. The ship scraped against the cavern ceiling at one point, but the hull held. He clenched his teeth, praying they wouldn't be trapped. A jolt of wind pummeled them as they emerged from the cave into the swirling dust. Visibility was nearly zero, the sensors scrambled by particulate interference. She guided them, using short-range readings. The craft wove through towering rock spires, the thrusters kicking up clouds of glittering blue sediment. They veered east, away from where the Dominion ships had been scanning. Once clear of the labyrinthine rock formations, Violari gunned the engines, sending them rocketing across the alien landscape. The dust storm parted around them in shimmering gusts. Far above, the sky flickered with hints of the star field. His heartbeat thundered as he watched the sensor readouts. Any moment now, the Dominion ships could detect them. Sure enough, alarms blared. 3 distinct signatures locked onto the craft, scanning them. Violari's jaw tightened. She increased speed, ignoring the incoming hail. The planet's curvature offered them a brief window before those ships could get a weapons lock. "There's a ridge up ahead," he warned. "Pull up!" She yanked the controls, the ship climbing sharply. The ridge whipped past beneath them, rocky peaks flashing in the viewports. Then they were in open air, crossing into the upper atmosphere. Lights on the console blinked red as the Dominion locked weapons. A missile alert shrieked. She threw the craft into a spiraling dive to evade, the G-forces slamming him into his seat. The missile streaked past, bursting in a flash of plasma. He clenched his teeth, grabbing onto the console for support. Another lock warning. She unleashed the meager countermeasures they had, jamming the second missile's guidance system. It exploded harmlessly in the emptiness behind them. "Clear the atmosphere!" he shouted, adrenaline spiking. "We can jump soon." She angled the ship upward, engines roaring. The hull rattled ominously as they broke through the planet's upper layers. The black of space opened before them, studded with stars. But the Dominion patrol ships were on them. One soared into view, pivoting to unleash a laser barrage. She rolled the craft, narrowly avoiding a direct hit. Alarms wailed. He cursed, diverting power to the rear shields. A final barrage clipped the ship's stern, causing sparks to arc across the cabin. She fought the controls, managing to steady them. The FTL indicator blinked, only partially charged. They had seconds before another salvo arrived. "Come on!" she growled at the console. "Charge!" The Dominion ship lined up for another pass. Kieran could see the glow of its cannons in the rear cameras. This was it. If the FTL didn't come online now, they were finished. At the last heartbeat, the indicator turned green. Violari slammed the lever, and the ship lurched forward into FTL, stars stretching into elongated streaks. The cockpit flooded with the dizzying swirl of hyperspace. They'd done it, escaped the planet and the patrol ships. For the moment, they were free again. Exhaustion bore down on them. She slumped in the pilot's seat, breathing heavily, eyes half-lidded. He let out a shaky laugh that bordered on hysteria, leaning his head back. The cabin lights flickered, the damages from the near-miss evident in the sparking panels. He forced himself out of the seat, stumbling to retrieve a fire suppressant before a small console blaze could spread. She watched him from the corner of her eye, still too drained to move. Once the immediate danger was under control, he returned to her side. She exhaled, rolling her shoulders. "We made it," he nodded, heart still hammering. For now, they set the autopilot to cruise for a short span, letting them catch their breath. FTL would carry them away from Dominion space, at least, until they needed to drop out and plot a new course. She rose from the pilot's seat, body swaying slightly. He reached out instinctively, steadying her with a hand on her waist. She froze, glancing down at his hand, then up at him. The memory of their time in the cave, the desperation, the hunger, flared between them. He swallowed, unsure if she would push him away or respond. Her eyes reflected a swirl of color, a mixture of confusion and lingering desire. She curled her fingers into his shirt, silent. He pulled her closer, the hum of the engines vibrating through the floor. Their lips met in a moment that was less frenetic than before, but no less intense. She let out a shaky sigh, pressing against him. It was as though they'd both reached a breaking point, a need for human or alien contact. In the face of constant danger, their kiss deepened, tongues brushing, and he felt her nails curl into his shoulders. They broke apart, breathing heavily, foreheads touching. She whispered, "I don't know what this is." He stroked a thumb along the faint luminescent lines at her jaw, each breath hot against her skin. "I don't either." Her eyes flicked away. "Everything in my life was built on the Dominion's doctrine. Now I'm running, fighting them alongside a human I once thought beneath me." He felt a pang of anger at the reminder, but also empathy for her turmoil. "I won't pretend to forgive what your empire did to mine, but I can't deny what's happening between us." She took a step back, arms crossing over her chest. "We should focus on surviving first." He forced a rueful smile. "Right, survive now. Figure out whatever this is later." She nodded. Agreed. They spent the next few hours in tense collaboration, patching up the ship's damage and monitoring the FTL systems. Neither spoke of their kiss or the cave. Yet the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension, equal parts attraction and wariness. Eventually, the systems required a cool-down, forcing them to drop out of FTL in a remote sector. Stars glittered against the blackness, no planets in immediate range. She checked the sensors, verifying they were alone. They let the engine rest, drifting in silent space. He brought her a ration pack, the best they could do for a meal. She took it with a word of thanks. They ate in the dim cockpit light, each lost in thought. Finally, he cleared his throat. Where do we go from here? The Dominion's going to be hunting you as a traitor, and me as well, obviously. She watched the stars. There are scattered resistance groups in the outer systems. Perhaps we can contact them, offer them knowledge of Dominion weaknesses. If we keep running, eventually we'll get cornered. Better to strike first. He nodded slowly. You mean, fight back, join a rebellion? She turned to look at him, eyes reflecting distant starlight. Isn't that what you've been doing your whole life? Fighting back? A dry chuckle escaped him. Yeah, but usually with a tiny chance of winning. You're talking about taking on the entire Dominion. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. I've seen cracks in the empires. Armor, Kieran. There are internal struggles, factions vying for power. If we exploit that, we might stand a chance. He met her gaze, feeling a strange surge of solidarity. We'll do it. Find these rebels. Show them what we know. Her lips quirked in a faint, almost sad smile. Then we become fugitives. Outlaws in every sense. He shrugged. I've been an outlaw for years. Nothing new for me. She allowed a quiet laugh. I suppose not. Time drifted on. The engines cooled enough for another FTL jump. She calculated coordinates. For a remote system rumored to house a black market station, where they might refuel and gather intel. The jump was smoother this time, the repairs holding. The swirl of hyperspace enveloped them again. In the cramped quarters, they rotated shifts, one sleeping while the other monitored systems. But sleep brought little rest, plagued by nightmares of the arena, the Dominion's cruelty, the uncertain future. More than once, he jolted awake, disoriented, only to find her quietly observing him, her eyes revealing a mix of concern and that same haunting curiosity. He'd offer a brief nod before turning away. Their second sexual encounter happened 2 days later, in the midst of a minor crisis. A coolant line burst, flooding a portion of the ship with noxious fumes. They scrambled to seal the leak, working in tandem. She shut off the valve while he replaced the damaged section, both of them coughing through improvised masks. Once the line was fixed, the adrenaline was coursing through their veins, hearts hammering. They tore off the masks, leaning against the wall, panting. Water dripped from overhead pipes, and the small corridor was cramped. She looked at him with that familiar intensity, luminous lines throbbing along her neck and arms. He saw the same raw need in her eyes that he felt in his chest. Before he could speak, her mouth was on his, savage and immediate. He gripped her hips, pinning her to the wall. This time, there was a desperate edge to it, an outpouring of frustration and fear. She bit at his lower lip, and he groaned, sliding a hand beneath the hem of her shirt. Her skin was slick with sweat, the glow brighter around her ribs. They fumbled, half falling into a small storage alcove. She straddled him as he sank to the floor, pulling at the fastenings of his clothes. Their breaths mingled in the confined space, each shift of their bodies accompanied by the hiss of old metal. He tore open her shirt, baring her glowing skin, the luminescent patterns swirling wildly. Their coupling was as frantic as before, a tangle of limbs and ragged moans. She rode him with a ferocity that spoke of suppressed rage and yearning. He responded in kind, grasping her waist, meeting her every movement with equal force. Her nails clawed at his shoulders, and he welcomed the sting. At the crest of release, they clung to each other like survivors of a shipwreck, adrift in a sea of contradictions. The world narrowed to the sound of her voice rasping his name, the pulse of her glowing lines, the slick heat and friction that drove them both over the edge. They shuddered together, the tension in their bodies snapping like an overstretched bowstring. Afterward, they slumped against each other, catching their breath in the claustrophobic darkness. Sweat beaded on his brow, and her hair fell in damp strands around her face. She pressed her forehead to his, eyes closed. He let himself hold her for a moment, the pounding of their hearts gradually slowing. When she pulled back, her expression was guarded. He half expected regret or anger, but she just studied him with a resigned acceptance. He brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear, not sure what to say. Words felt inadequate. She stood, smoothing her clothes, relatching her armor plates. He rose too, adjusting his disheveled attire, wincing at a fresh scratch across his collarbone. They stepped back into the corridor, silent except for their labored breathing. The coolant leak was fixed, the crisis averted, but another layer of complexity bound them tighter. They resumed their duties as though nothing had happened, yet everything felt charged. Each accidental brush of hands sent a spark through him. Every time she glanced his way, a flush of heat colored her cheeks, even as her expression remained stoic. Soon, they reached the coordinates of the rumored black market station, a hidden outpost orbiting a gas giant in the far reaches of unclaimed space. It was cobbled together from old ships, asteroid mining rigs, and scraps from a dozen species. The faint glow of neon signs indicated docking bays. Violari guided their craft in, paying an exorbitant docking fee in stolen Dominion credits. The station was a study in controlled chaos. Smugglers, pirates, and exiles wandered its corridors. Holographic advertisements flickered overhead, touting everything from weapons to illicit augmentations. He felt on edge, hand always near his. Sidearm. Violari stuck close, her posture rigid. They had to be careful. Someone could recognize her Dominion gear, or him as the famed human warrior from the arena broadcasts. They found a dingy cantina at the station's core, a swirl of alien patrons nursing drinks under flickering lights. Smoke from unknown substances hazed the air. They claimed a corner table, scanning the crowd. He spotted a few humans, mostly down on their luck traders or mercenaries with a haunted look in their eyes. None paid him special attention. Violari put her hood up, masking her distinctive features. They ordered drinks from a surly bartender with 4 arms. The liquid burned on the way down, but he welcomed the brief warmth. She tapped into the local network via a datapad, searching for rumors of anti-Dominion groups. He watched her, noticing how her jaw clenched whenever the feed displayed news of Dominion conquests. She froze at one article. They're celebrating an annexation of a border world. The Dominion is broadcasting victory across the sector. That means the rebels lost another stronghold. He set his drink down. We might still find some who escaped. Scattered cells, she sighed, switching the feed. Another snippet caught her attention. A bounty listing. She stiffened, eyes widening. He leaned over to read. A Dominion posting offered a substantial reward for the capture of Violari, labeled a traitor, and Kieran Voss, the human war criminal. The sum was large enough to tempt any mercenary. Damn, he muttered. That's going to make things complicated. She stared at the listing, an odd mixture of betrayal and resignation. They're calling me a traitor, and you a savage, just as I expected. He reached for her hand under the table, giving it a quick, reassuring squeeze. We'll deal with it. She let out a shuddering breath, pulling her hood lower. We should keep moving. The longer we stay here, the higher the risk of someone recognizing us. They finished their drinks quickly. As they made their way out, a hulking alien with scaled skin and multiple eyes blocked their path, eyeing them suspiciously. Violari tensed, but Kieran quietly slipped a credit chit into the alien's hand, a subtle bribe. The creature shrugged and moved aside, apparently satisfied. They stepped into the main concourse, merging with the crowds. They found a small arms dealer stall, run by a wiry old man with a cybernetic eye. Kieran negotiated for extra munitions and a better shield generator using Dominion credits. The man eyed them warily, but didn't ask too many questions, typical for a station like this. Violari remained silent, letting Kieran handle the exchange. After securing supplies, they hurried back to the docking bay, hearts pounding at every turn. They spotted at least one bounty hunter's crest among the milling patrons, which quickened their pace. Only when they sealed themselves back in their craft did they exhale in relief. He stowed the supplies while she installed the shield generator. The hum of the station outside rattled the hull. He could sense her frustration in her clipped movements and tense silence. After a while, he approached to help. She glanced at him, expression taut, but let him work alongside her. They spoke little, finishing the installation in an hour. Then, they powered the engines, preparing for departure. The station's traffic control gave them clearance, apparently ignorant of their identities or too corrupt to care. The docking clamps released with a metallic groan. As they eased away from the station's docking ring, the scan displayed several ships in the vicinity. One, a small, sleek vessel, changed course to follow them. He cursed under his breath, toggling the comm. No hail came through, but the presence of that ship felt ominous. Violari accelerated, leaving the station's gravity well behind. The other ship matched their velocity. She changed course again. It persisted. He felt an icy dread coil in his gut. That had to be a bounty hunter. Violari's lips thinned. She routed power to engines, pushing them toward FTL range. Still, the pursuer kept up, inching closer. With a grim look, she diverted some power to weapons. If they try to board us, we fight. He gritted his teeth, scanning the pursuers. Readouts. Looks like a high-speed stealth craft, well armed. We can't outrun it easily. She armed the forward cannons. Then we make them regret picking this fight. Before they could charge the weapons, the enemy ship opened fire. A barrage of plasma scorched their shields, sending a shower of sparks through the cabin. Violari retaliated, unleashing a volley of energy bolts. The bounty hunter evaded deftly, returning another strike that rocked their vessel. Kieran strapped in, calling up the targeting feed. I'll handle weapons. You focus on flying. She nodded, maneuvering in a wild corkscrew that nearly dislodged him from his seat. He took aim, finger trembling on the trigger. Their shields flickered dangerously under the bounty hunter's assault. At last, he found an opening, launching 2 missiles. The pursuer banked hard, but one missile struck its flank, causing a bright explosion of vented atmosphere. A triumphant surge coursed through him, but the bounty hunter ship continued, albeit with a wobble. Violari seized the moment to race ahead, putting distance between them. The FTL drive beeped readiness. She yanked the lever, and their craft lunged into hyperspace just as another plasma bolt grazed them. They hurtled away, the swirl of hyperspace engulfing them. But damage warnings lit the console. The hull integrity on the starboard side was compromised. She muttered a string of curses, tapping the readouts. "We won't get far like this. Better than being captured." He ran a diagnostic. "We can drop out in an uncharted sector. Do repairs." She nodded, setting a course for a remote region. Adrenaline still roared in his veins. He saw it reflected in her eyes, the savage thrill of another narrow escape. For a split second, he let himself wonder what it would feel like if they weren't constantly running, fighting for their lives. Would they have found each other without the crucible of war? When they exited FTL, they found themselves near an isolated binary star system. 2 pale suns danced around each other, casting eerie light across a handful of dead rocks. She guided the craft to one such planetoid, scanning for a stable landing zone. They found a crater with minimal atmosphere. The landing was rough, the craft shuddering as it settled on the rocky surface. Once again, they powered down to preserve stealth. He unbuckled, following her to the cargo hold to assess the hull damage. Outside, the planetoid's surface was a bleak expanse of jagged rock under the glow of twin suns. He donned an environment suit, handing another to her. Together, they exited through the airlock. The low gravity tugged less insistently at their boots. The hull damage was extensive. A ragged hole near the aft thrusters exposed vital components. She cursed softly, shining her handheld light over the shredded metal. They had patch materials, but it would take time to properly seal. In near silence, they set to work, applying sealant and armor patches. The suit's comms crackled with their labored breathing. The radiation from the binary stars made the suits hum, forcing them to keep an eye on environmental readouts. Each movement was careful, methodical. The memory of their closeness in the corridors, in the cave, weighed on both of them, but the urgent task at hand took precedence. Hours later, exhausted, they retreated inside. The patch job would hold, but it was far from perfect. They doffed the suits, each sagging with fatigue. He found some water in the supplies, handing her a flask. She drank deeply, then passed it back. Their eyes met, a quiet understanding exchanged. He collapsed onto a storage crate, rubbing his temples. She sank onto the floor, leaning against the hull. The constant cycle of life and death struggle wore on them both. He wanted to say something comforting, but the words felt inadequate. She spoke first, voice low. "When I was a child, my father took me on a tour of conquered worlds. He showed me the devastation, told me it was necessary for progress. I believed him." She closed her eyes. "Seeing you, fighting beside you, has made me question everything." He pushed off the crate, crouching in front of her. "I can't change what the Dominion did to Earth or any other planet, but you're here, trying to stop them. That has to count for something." A faint sadness flitted across her features. "I can never undo the pain we caused your people." He reached out, laying a tentative hand on her knee. "I'm not asking you to atone for all of it. Just help me ensure it doesn't keep happening." She opened her eyes, luminous in the dim cabin. "I will." They sat like that for a moment, the thrumming of the damaged engines the only backdrop. Then, in a gesture that felt both simple and monumental, she lifted a hand to cradle his cheek. He leaned into the touch, letting his eyes close. The connection between them was fragile, forged by necessity and deepened by undeniable chemistry, yet it felt real. He slid closer, and she tilted her head, her breath washing over his face. They kissed softly this time, a slow, tender exchange that contrasted sharply with their previous frantic couplings. Her lips moved against his with cautious reverence, as if acknowledging the vulnerability beneath their hardened exteriors. He brushed a thumb across her jaw, savoring the moment. When they parted, she stayed close, forehead resting against his. The sorrow in her eyes resonated with his own. They had lost so much, yet they'd found something improbable in each other, a reason to keep going beyond mere survival. They spent the next day repairing systems from inside the craft, double-checking the hull patch. The star readings indicated they could safely remain in the planetoid's shadow for a while. During that time, she showed him more of the Dominion encryption protocols she knew. He, in turn, shared the improvised combat tactics of human guerrilla fighters. Their synergy grew, each learning from the other. At one point, They discovered an old Dominion scout drone in the cargo hold, probably a leftover from the ship's prior missions. She reprogrammed it to detect and scramble Dominion signals, giving them a slim advantage in future encounters. He admired her skill, the meticulous way she worked. He also caught himself admiring the curve of her mouth, the shift of her muscles under her shirt. Heat stirred within him, remembering how it felt to have her pressed against him. But he focused on the task, not wanting to distract either of them from a precarious situation. When the scout drone was ready, they tested it outside, deploying it in the planetoid's orbit. It hummed to life, swirling away to cloak their presence. The initial results looked promising. Nearby scans would be disrupted, giving them precious seconds of warning if a Dominion force arrived. After the test, they stood on the planetoid's surface again, the twin suns low on the horizon. The weird twilight cast shifting shadows across the pitted ground. She looked up at the bright points of stars overhead, arms crossed. He stepped beside her, gaze tracing the same distant constellations. "Somewhere out there," he said, "people are still resisting. They need help. We can give them the intel, show them Dominion weaknesses." She nodded, luminous eyes, reflecting the starlight. "I spent my life mastering Dominion battle doctrine. Now I'll use it against them." He turned to her, heart pounding. "I'm with you." She glanced sideways, a hint of a wry smile on her lips. "I know." They returned to the ship, finalizing preparations to leave the planetoid. With the new cloak drone in orbit, they powered up the engines at low output, drifting away from the surface. Once clear of the gravitational pull, Vailari plotted a course deeper into uncharted space, searching for the rumored pockets of rebellion. For days, they sailed through the void, dropping in and out of FTL to avoid detection. Their progress was slow, but it gave them time to refine their strategy. She trained him in alien weapon systems, and he coached her on resourceful, unorthodox maneuvers gleaned from human insurgencies. They grew comfortable with each other's presence, sharing ration packs, exchanging snippets of personal histories in the hush of the cockpit. Their physical relationship continued in stolen moments, as inevitable as the breath in their lungs. Sometimes it was desperate and raw, an outlet for the frustrations of constant danger. Other times it was tender, almost reverent. Each time left them more entangled, more uncertain about how to balance intimacy and warfare. Eventually, they picked up a faint resistance signal on an old Dominion frequency. Vailari recognized the encryption patterns, hypothesizing it came from a breakaway faction. They followed the signal to a battered space station, hidden in a dense asteroid field near a dying star. The station's transmissions revealed it to be a covert base of ex-Dominion rebels, a small but determined group. He felt a jolt of anticipation. If they could ally with these rebels, maybe they could start turning the tide. She guided the ship carefully through the asteroid field, using thrusters in short bursts. The station loomed ahead, half dark from disrepair. Laser turrets tracked them as they approached, suspicious but not firing. They hailed the station, announcing they had crucial intel. After a tense exchange, the station's leader, an alien named Corral, agreed to let them dock. He sounded wary but hopeful. They landed in a cramped bay, strewn with mismatched parts. When the ramp lowered, they stepped out into the stale air, both on high alert. A group of armed aliens awaited them. Corral, tall and reptilian, approached with narrowed eyes. He studied Vailari's Dominion armor and Kieran's human features. "You claim you have intel to share. Why should we trust you?" Vailari's posture stiffened, but Kieran spoke first. "Because we both have reason to hate the Dominion, and we can help you fight them." One of the rebels sneered. "A Dominion warrior and a human savage working together sounds like a trick." She stepped forward, face set. "I betrayed the Dominion. They placed a bounty on me. I'm here to help you dismantle them from the inside." He saw the doubt in the rebels' eyes. The tension crackled, weapons half raised. Corral hissed a command, telling them to lower their arms. "We'll hear you out." He gestured for them to follow. "But any deception, and we'll space you." Kieran and Vailari exchanged a look. They had no choice but to comply. They followed the rebels through dim corridors to a control room humming with jury-rigged systems. A star map flickered on a central display, highlighting Dominion outposts. Corral folded his arms, glaring with suspicion. "All right, tell us why we shouldn't throw you out an airlock." Vailari accessed a datapad, uploading the Dominion codes she'd stolen. She showed them detailed plans of upcoming fleet movements, vulnerabilities in starbase defenses, and evidence of internal power struggles. The rebels crowding around. The display muttered in amazement, seeing confirmation of intel they could only speculate about. Coral's scaly brows rose. "This is impossible to fake. You truly have Dominion command data." She nodded. I was part of their elite force. I know how they think. This is just a fraction of what I can offer. Kieran stepped in. My people suffered under the Dominion. We want them brought down. We'll fight alongside you if you'll have us. A tense silence followed. Then, Corral gestured to his aides. Run these codes. Verify them. If they're genuine, we might have a shot at something bigger. The rebels dispersed to examine the data. A tall, willowy figure in ragged clothing offered them seats near a console. As they waited, Valari eyed the battered condition of the station. Flickering lights, scorch marks from old battles, oxygen recyclers that whined. This was a small operation, barely holding together. Finally, one of the aides reported back. The codes are real. Dominion transmissions match. This data could give us a massive advantage. Corral turned to them, eyes gleaming. If this is a trap, it's an elaborate one. But I suspect you're sincere. He drew in a breath. We'll form an alliance, see how we can strike back. For now, you're welcome here. But be warned. If you betray us, there's nowhere in the galaxy you can hide. Valari inclined her head. Understood. Kieran let out a silent breath of relief. This was the closest thing to hope he'd felt in years. They spent the next few hours presenting more data, brainstorming infiltration strategies, and forging a plan to coordinate with other scattered cells. The rebels, though small in number, displayed fierce resolve. As the meeting wore on, exhaustion pulled at him. Valari's stance showed the same fatigue, though she masked it well. At last, Corral dismissed them, assigning them a small bunk area off a side corridor. The room was cramped, housing only a single bunk bed and a flickering overhead light. They locked the door behind them for privacy. He sank onto the lower bunk, leaning his head back against the metal wall. She stood nearby, arms folded, gaze drifting. The closeness of the space, the hum of the station, the tension of the meeting, they all pressed on him. His mind spun with the possibilities of what they might achieve here. She moved closer, eyes searching his. We have a chance now, she said softly. A real chance to strike a blow that matters. He nodded, catching her hand in his, and we'll do it together. She exhaled, something like relief washing over her features. Without further words, she eased onto the bunk beside him. They sat in silence for a while, the station's hum the only sound. Then she rested her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped an arm around her. It wasn't the wild, desperate coupling of before, just a quiet moment of intimacy. A recognition that they were allies in every sense of the word. He felt her breath against his neck, and a warm ache fluttered in his chest. Surrounded by metal walls and the faint smell of engine grease, they found a fragile peace. They had come so far from that first brutal clash in the arena. Neither knew what the future held, but for this moment they drew solace from the nearness of each other. In the days that followed, they worked side by side with the rebels. Corral assigned them to a team preparing to infiltrate a Dominion depot in a neighboring sector. Valari's intimate knowledge of Dominion protocols guided the plan. Kieran's battlefield instincts shaped the strike team's training. They faced skepticism and occasional hostility from some rebels who refused to trust a Dominion defector or a human rumored to be a merciless killer. But over time, they earned some measure of acceptance. They moved from the station to a hidden cruiser the rebels had salvaged. Valari and Kieran co-led a small squad, staging practice runs, drilling infiltration tactics. Late nights found them poring over star maps, analyzing supply routes, creating fallback strategies. Their synergy deepened. They argued occasionally. She insisted on certain Dominion procedures, while he pushed for more guerrilla-style improvisation. But the arguments ended in mutual respect, and sometimes in fierce make-up sex behind locked cabin doors. The final battle plan crystallized, a coordinated strike at 3 Dominion depots simultaneously, forcing the Empire to split its forces. Corral's people would handle 2 targets, relying on sabotage and diversion. Valari and Kieran's team would assault the main depot, crippling a vital supply line. They had inside data on security overrides, which could turn the tide if used correctly. On the eve of the operation, tension ran high on the cruiser. Valari and Kieran holed up in their shared quarters, finalizing gear. She checked the calibrations on her energy blades, a distant look in her eyes. He loaded mags and tested the new shield generator strapped to his arm. Despite the flurry of tasks, a current of anxiety bound them. He watched her from across the small cabin. "You're thinking about your father, aren't you?" She paused, eyes flicking up. "I was," he nodded. They'd spoken only briefly about him, an influential Dominion commander who had indoctrinated her from birth. She had no idea what had become of him since her defection. She sighed. "If he's still alive, he'll be at the Dominion's core worlds, safe behind the fleets. He'd call me a traitor." He set aside his gear, crossing the room to gently place a hand on her shoulder. "You're doing what's right." Her gaze flickered. The luminous lines on her neck dimmed. I know, still, it weighs on me. He leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers. You're stronger than you think. She closed her eyes, drawing in a steadying breath. Thank you. They held each other for a moment before returning to preparations. No more words were needed. The die was cast. The next morning, the strike team assembled in the cruiser's hangar. Coral's voice crackled over comms, confirming the other squads were in position. Vile Ari donned her black Dominion armor, stripped of insignias, with additional plates to accommodate the rebel tech. Kieran wore reinforced tactical gear, a patchwork of salvaged materials. They nodded to each other, stepping onto the waiting transport shuttle with half a dozen rebels. The flight to the target was tense but uneventful. The Dominion depot floated near a small moon, ringed by automated defenses. Vile Ari input override codes, buying them a precious window to land before the station recognized the infiltration. The shuttle slipped into a cargo bay unchallenged, the doors sealing behind them. Once inside, the real fight began. Dominion guards spotted the intruders, sounding the alarm. Energy bolts streaked across the hangar. Vile Ari and Kieran led the charge, a whirlwind of precision and brute force. Her blades hummed with lethal grace, slicing through armor. His gun barked in short, controlled bursts, dropping foes with ruthless efficiency. The rebels behind them fanned out, planting charges on critical systems. The corridors echoed with shouts and blaster fire. Smoke filled the air, lights flickering. They progressed methodically, clearing each sector. Dominion reinforcements arrived, but Vile Ari used her knowledge of security protocols to seal blast doors, diverting squads away. Kieran covered her, picking off any stragglers who slipped through. The rebels moved with disciplined purpose, seizing control of key modules. They reached the central command hub, where the depot's commander waited with an elite squad. A pitched battle erupted. Kieran took a glancing hit to the leg, staggering, but he fought through the pain. Vile Ari faced the commander, exchanging fierce blows. Sparks flew as her blade clashed with the commander's staff weapon. The rebels covered them, returning fire at the elite guards. Kieran, forced to reload behind a console, saw Vile Ari falter, an injury to her side. Adrenaline spiked. He vaulted over the console, firing a volley that forced the commander to pivot, giving Vile Ari an opening. She surged up, blade slicing clean through the staff, and drove her second blade into the commander's chest. The alien toppled, eyes dimming. An eerie stillness descended. Smoke wafted from shattered panels. The rebels cheered in ragged voices. Vile Ari clutched her side, breathing hard. Kieran rushed to her, supporting her weight. Blood seeped between her fingers, her luminous patterns flickering in distress. "We did it," she gasped, forcing a pained smile. He kissed her forehead. "Stay with me. Let's get that wound patched." She nodded, leaning on him as the rebels set charges to destroy the depot's stockpiles. Time was short. Alarms blared, indicating Dominion reinforcements inbound. They made a strategic withdrawal, carrying wounded. Kieran limped, leg throbbing, but refused to slow. Fire and explosions rocked the corridors as the charges detonated. Flames devoured the station's vital supplies, dealing a blow to the Dominion war machine. The shuttle lifted off just as Dominion ships arrived, too late to prevent the sabotage. Kieran and Vile Ari slumped in the hold, bleeding and exhausted, but victorious. A rebel medic administered basic care. The entire team was battered, yet a surge of triumph filled the air. By the time they returned to the rebel cruiser, the other squads reported similar successes. All 3 depots had been disabled. Dominion supply lines were crippled in this sector. Morale soared. Coral congratulated them, praising Vile Ari's intel and Kieran's leadership. The station broadcast messages of hope across rebel channels, urging more cells to rise. In the medbay, she lay on a bunk, bandaged. Kieran hovered beside her, ignoring his own injuries. Her eyes fluttered open, meeting his. "We're making a difference," she whispered, voice rasping. He nodded, stroking her hair gently. "Yeah, one victory at a time." She managed a small, tired grin. For Earth, for every world Dominion crushed. He leaned down, pressing a tender kiss to her brow. "For all of us." Over the next days, they recovered together. Her wound healed thanks to advanced rebel med tech. His leg injury mended, though it left another scar to match the countless others. The rebellious faction used the momentum of their triumph to recruit more volunteers, forging alliances with other cells. Slowly, the tide began to shift. He found her one evening on the observation deck, staring at the starfield. The bandage around her waist was gone, replaced by faint scarring. She looked both weary and resolute. He joined her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, letting out a soft sigh. "We've come a long way from that arena," she murmured. He tightened his hold, gazing at the endless sea of stars. "You wanted to kill me then?" She let out a low laugh. It was my duty, and you nearly killed me too. He turned to her, eyes shining. I'm glad we both failed. She traced a glowing fingertip along his jaw. Me too. They kissed under the quiet watch of the cosmos. It wasn't the savage clash of before, but something deeper. A promise forged in mutual respect and shared purpose. When they broke apart, he saw the future reflected in her eyes. More battles, more sacrifices, but also the possibility of lasting change. He set a hand on the observation rail, pulling her closer. So what happens now? She rested her head on his shoulder, voice steady. We keep fighting until the Dominion falls, or we do. He pressed a soft kiss to her temple. Together, they stood there, silhouettes framed by starlight, hearts beating in unison. They were still fugitives, still pursued by an empire that called them both traitors. But they had each other, and an entire rebel network rallying to their cause. It would be enough. In the months that followed, the rebellion's sparks ignited into a blaze, fueled by the intel Valari provided, and the tenacity Kieran embodied. Word of their victories spread across the galaxy, inspiring new uprisings. The Dominion, once unassailable, found itself fighting multiple fronts. Internal discord grew, and even some high-ranking officers defected, emboldened by the legend of a human warrior deemed weak and an alien elite who dared to stand with him. Eventually, the final blow came on the Dominion capital world itself, where a coalition of rebel forces launched a coordinated offensive. Kieran and Violari led the ground assault, cutting through wave after wave of defenders. She faced her father in a climactic showdown, challenging him in a duel that shook the gilded halls of the Dominion Palace. He still tried to convince her to return, to renounce her betrayal, but her resolve never wavered. She defeated him in single combat, sparing his life but destroying his legacy. Meanwhile, Kieran's unstoppable advance became the rallying cry for human survivors and oppressed aliens alike. He hacked into the Dominion's central command systems, broadcasting a final message. The age of Dominion tyranny was done. The key capital fell. The empire fractured. Standing on the palace balcony, battered and bloody, Violari and Kieran gazed out at the burning city. Rebel flags rose where the Dominion crest once flew. Civilians poured into the streets, overthrowing the last vestiges of oppressive rule. She leaned into him, the glow on her skin flickering in the twilight. It's over, she whispered, voice trembling with disbelief. He wrapped an arm around her waist, ignoring the pain of his wounds. It's a start. We have to rebuild now, she nodded, tears glistening. At least we can do it without fear. Without shackles. Their lips met in a tender kiss, sealing the triumph they'd bled for. The war was won. No cliffhangers left. The galaxy had changed forever. And though they would face new challenges in the days to come, unifying splintered worlds, forging peace in the ruins of empire, they would do so together, bound by the unbreakable bond forged in the crucible of battle and the fire of undeniable raw passion. They stepped off the balcony hand in hand, the final roar of victory echoing across the devastated metropolis. Scars on their bodies, memories of savage fights, and an all-consuming desire that had begun in blood and ended in liberation. This was their story, complete, decisive, and unyielding. The alien woman had once believed the human warrior was weak, but now her entire species knew the truth. There was nothing more terrifying, nor more beautiful, than the power they discovered in each other.